Listen now to reading today. I want to read to you from the 19th chapter of 1 Kings, the first 15 verses, a part of the story of the life of Elijah the prophet. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree, and he asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. And suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very jealous for the Lord of hosts, the God of hosts, for Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand before the mountain, before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in an earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. And when he heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they are seeking to take my life, to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram." The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord shall stand forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Grant, O Lord, that we might be the masters of ourselves to become the servants of others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for Thee. Amen. This past Wednesday, I was driving in my car when a little segment came on National Public Radio on the history of the blues. Maybe you heard that this past Wednesday. They did a little retrospective on the blues as a musical genre and its history, how it came to be. And what I learned on NPR this week is that, you may already know this, I did not know it, the blues originated as plantation work songs of African slaves in the Mississippi Delta in the 1800s, the 19th century. They referred in the NPR piece to the work of a man named Alan Lomax. He is kind of known as the genre, the blues central historian. In fact, he spent much of the 20th century, Alan Lomax did, as a historian, traveling the South, interviewing different musicians, and recording much of what they played in camps and taverns in the South in the early part of the 20th century. And in the later part of the 20th century, he produced a documentary that became one of the seminal pieces of research on the blues. It's entitled Where the Blues Began, based on all of those interviews that he did. But one piece that grabbed my attention in the radio spot that I heard this week was a piece from one of his subjects, a man named Gatemouth Moore. Have you ever heard of Gatemouth Moore? I had not. But he's a famous blues player from the early part of the 20th century. And he was quoted as saying this: "It takes a man that has the blues to sing the blues. But you know, our music came to have a bigger following than we ever thought, because sooner or later, anybody who has any brains gets the blues." Oh, I like that. I suppose it's pretty much true. When I heard him say that, anybody with any brains at some point or other gets the blues, it reminded me, don't they talk about depression as being the common cold of mental illness? Maybe that's just the clinical way of saying the same thing that Gatemouth Moore was saying. Sooner or later, everybody who's alert, is going to have a low moment, or maybe a significant number of them. It doesn't seem to matter how talented we are, how smart we are. Certainly doesn't seem to matter how religiously astute we are or how strong our faith. Sooner or later, Gatemouth says, everybody with any brains gets the blues. And I, for one, I don't know about you, but don't you find it comforting that our faith leaves room for the fact that we don't have to be on a high note all the time? Our faith, in its healthiest expression, leaves room for the fact that everybody has low moments and that God can be found even in those times when we don't feel even like looking for God. Certainly, we get many examples in Scripture of people who are kind of struggling with low moments and trying to find their way through when the way is certainly not all that clear. And of course, I bring this up because such is the case for the prophet Elijah. That reading from 1 Kings 19, we get to eavesdrop on the life of Elijah at a moment when he is not at his best, to say the least. Here he is, moping under a broom tree, feeling sorry for himself. He's despondent. He's fearful. He's wondering when the next shoe is going to drop, when the next bad thing is going to happen to him. And if you just pluck that 19th chapter out, as I did this morning, and read it, you might assume that leading up to this, there have been a lot of bad things happening to Elijah, that he's been on a low moment. Had a number of things that were going wrong in his life, but you'd be wrong if you assumed that, because interestingly enough, he has just come through, in the chapters before this, a kind of wonderful series of victories and successes in his role as a prophet. He's had enough success that he would be remembered as really kind of the Old Testament lion of a prophet because of what he has done just in the 2 chapters before this. Elijah's story is one of those stories that I think every biblically literate person should know. And just to refresh your memory, you probably already know, but let me just run through the backstory that brings Elijah to this point where he is in the 19th chapter. Elijah comes on the scene about 900 BC, and it's the time when Ahab is the king of Israel. And Ahab, against the religious law of his day, it's been a long history that people who are in power tend to make exceptions of themselves when it comes to following the rules that they want everybody else to follow. And Ahab is one of those guys. There is a rule in ancient Israel that you're not supposed to marry outside of the family of Israel. But Ahab decides he's going to exempt himself for that, and he takes a Canaanite woman for his wife, Jezebel. And from day one, Jezebel proves to be trouble, big trouble in a lot of ways, because not only is she a foreigner, but she has her own religion that she takes very seriously. Baalism, which is the religion of the Canaanite prophet before Israel arrived in the land. Historians, if you know just a little bit about Baalism, it's kind of a nature religion, and its focus was basically threefold. It was focused on the mysterious nature of life, and the miracle of regeneration and birth and reproduction. And also it was focused on the mysteries around human sexuality. So to put it mildly, some Baal worship was pretty interesting, to say the least. I won't go into the details of it here. But trust me, it was R-rated, the Baal practices of the day. So here we have Queen Jezebel, devoted to Baal worship, and marries Ahab, and when she moves into Ahab's palace, she brings along with her 400 of her favorite priests and 400 prophets of Baal. So Ahab's got a big problem, right, with his brand new bride. I mean, Israel worships Yahweh, the one God, and the worship of other gods, polytheism, that is verboten, strictly forbidden, of course. You shall have no other gods before me, commandment number 1. And now Ahab has got something like 800 Baal-worshiping religious professionals living with him in the palace, along with his new wife, Jezebel. Which reminds me, Mark Twain said something about ministers once. He said, preachers are a lot like cow manure. When there's a whole lot of them together, they raise a big stink, but you spread them out across the land, and they can do some good. 800 clergymen, all under that one roof with Ahab and Jezebel, worshiping Baal and not Yahweh. I mean, that's the backstory. You probably remember this, but it's good. It's a good story for everybody who knows the Bible to know. And so if you can picture that, that's where Elijah comes in. He comes in, as God's man, and he tells Ahab that because of his 800 house guests, there is going to be a drought. God will send a drought, and he's right, there is. 2 years pass. The drought continues, and it gets severe enough to the point that Ahab summons Elijah. He's desperate. The 800 house guests are still there. He hasn't been courageous enough to stand up to his wife and kick those 800 clergymen out. They're still there in the palace, but after 2 years of drought, things get critical enough that Ahab summons Elijah, and Elijah says, you don't have the courage to do the right thing. I can take the bull by the horns here. I will do it. And he challenges Jezebel's priests. Elijah does. 1 against 800. Elijah says, let's have a contest. I challenge you. It's almost to a kind of pray-off to see whose God will actually prevail. And so they do. They go up to Mount Carmel, and if you read the Bible a lot, you'll know that the Bible is not always neat and sanitary, nor is it entirely logical in how it tells stories, and never is that more true than in what happens next. The priests and the prophets of Baal go first, and they pray and they chant and they sing to Baal to send down fire, and nothing happens. And so they try harder, and this goes on for a number of verses in the chapter preceding where we are. They are singing and praying and dancing around, and so much so Elijah can't resist, and at one point he suggests, maybe your God is taking a nap. You should try a little harder. And so there's this kind of a playfulness to the contest. And finally, out of frustration, the priests and the prophets of Baal, all 800 of them, give up, and they step aside and say, okay, let's see if you can do any better, they say to Elijah. And so the story is Elijah prays, but before he does that, he's going to pray for God to send down fire, but first he has it all doused in water just to make it extra hard to get the fire going, but he prays, and lo and behold, a great fire emerges. Yahweh sends down fire, and lo and behold, it's a great vindication for the God of Israel, and it's the end also, at that moment, of the devastating drought in Israel. The chapter ends, you may remember, King Ahab is happily riding home in his chariot in the rain, and Elijah is running ahead. He's the champion. This is not a low point in his life at all. But when he gets home, Jezebel is informed as to what's happened, that God is God and not Baal, and that now all of the prophets and priests are gone. They actually were killed by this greater prophet, Elijah, and that's when the story starts to unravel for Elijah. Jezebel dictates a letter to Elijah, the content of which you heard. Within 24 hours, you're a dead man. That's the letter, basically. And interestingly enough, that's enough to put Elijah, this spiritual powerhouse, at this high moment. That puts him into a trough of depression. Just that one thing. And sometimes it can work that way in life. I had a lady tell me once, I feel so much like when I get my bearings from other people and when I get feedback, I feel so much like a stereo that's out of balance. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, somebody can tell me 99 positive things about me, 99 things that they like and that they really appreciate. And then they get to the one thing that they find a little troubling, and they'll say, you're thoughtful and you're kind and you're compassionate. She can go for 99, and then they say, but this, and she says, and immediately I hear nothing at all of the 99, and I just only hear the one thing that comes after the word but. Sometimes criticism is so much more easy to hear and to take to heart than all of the positive. And apparently, Elijah has the same balance problem of my friend. All of the good is immediately swept aside, and he flees the palace, and he runs for his life, and he hides under a broom tree, and God shows up. Not so much, interestingly, not so much as a comforter, a consoler, but more like a drill sergeant. Arise and eat, Elijah, lest this journey be too great for you. It was William Sloane Coffin who once said, the purpose of good religion is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I always like that definition. And this is one of those times when religion is afflicting Elijah with a sense of, don't give up so fast. Arise and eat. This may be a little bit of a bump in the road, but come on. What are you going to do about it? You're going to just there's more I've got in mind for you. Arise and eat. If nothing else, what you can conclude from this is that at this low point in his life, God treats him as if his religion is more about attitude than it is having all the answers at this point. And that's really true, don't you think? So often when we are low, when we see our faith as having more to do with the way it affects our attitude than having all the answers to our problems, that makes a big difference, I think. And at that moment, Elijah's attitude was getting in the way, and it was more dangerous to him in some ways than Jezebel's threat to his safety. So that's why I think God says what he says. What are you doing here? Arise and eat. Get going. And what's interesting is that Elijah is at least honest enough to not hold back in sharing the fact that he doesn't want to. He's resistant, and he's at least honest enough to say, I'm not feeling like doing what you want me to do. Here's his little speech. He's kind of like, I've been fighting the good fight for you, and I don't feel like you're helping me as much as I would like. I've been very jealous for the Lord of hosts, for the people of Israel, forsaken thy covenants, thrown down thy altars, slain thy prophets, and even I only, you had nothing to do with it, God. It's just all about me. Even I only am the one working here. They seek my life now to take it away. And I have to say, this may be at least some biblical evidence that if you need to change your attitude, maybe one way to get started is to at least be honest enough to let your hurts out. I give him credit, won't you? He's at least trusts God enough to be honest and have this little cathartic moment. Just get it out. Here's what I'm bothered about, and have done with it by naming it out loud. When I was out in San Francisco last week, I was reading about Native American spirituality. I'm interested in that, and there's a lot of literature now about the interface between Native American spirituality and its reverence for creation and seeing the divine in all of life, really, and Christian faith. And one of the things I read about was there is a ceremony in the Hazhazhe Native American tradition where if somebody is going through a long term of resentment, grief that's hard to overcome, if they're feeling kind of chronically low in life, the tribal elders come and see them, and they visit with them about their kind of low-grade depression that they can't seem to get behind or beyond. And what they do is this. There's a little ritual for this. You go out into the woods with two tribal elders. They go out with you, and you dig what amounts to kind of like a shallow grave. It's about 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. And then here's what you do. You lay down in this grave, and you speak out loud with the two tribal elders, one on each side. You kind of Get it all out. I resent this. This person has mistreated me. Have all of the complaints you have against the management of the universe come out. And here's all the things that are bugging me, hurting me, festering. And you have that all. The elders say nothing until you're done, and you can think of no more complaints to utter. And then they reach down, and they help you out, and you fill up the hole, and you plant a tree right where the hole was, on top. The ground is all soft now. The tree is ready to grow. And I thought, wow, now that's a ritual worth doing. We should all do that once a year, don't you think? What a good ritual. How much better is that than just a responsive reading? That's a ritual that would change your life. Lay down, have done with your troubles, and then plant something fruitful on top of it and get on with your life. Something like that, I think, is going on with Elijah. He gives his speech twice. Did you hear it? Same speech. He had to give it twice. Sometimes maybe that happens. But, there's a kind of a key theological piece in the story, I think, and that is that Elijah is kind of learning that his walk with God is not defined by the moment he is in, but rather the moment he is in is defined by his walk with God. I want to say it again because I think it's true. When we're at a low point, our walk with God isn't defined by the tough moments of our life, but rather it's the moments of our life that get defined by our walk with God. And that's why hope is always a possibility for people who have faith, and why God can come to Elijah in the middle of suffering, not just with a kind of pat on the shoulder and a poor you, but rather with a question that's designed to remind him that he still has choices he can make even when he doesn't feel like it. He can still act faithfully even when he doesn't feel faith in the depths of his heart. What are you doing here? Get up, he says, and go your way and anoint Hazael as king in Damascus. Anointing kings was the work of prophets. So basically he's saying, get up, get back to work. I know you aren't feeling faithful right now, but just act like you're faithful, and your faithfulness will catch up eventually. Just go ahead and be that, even though you're not feeling like it, and let the feelings catch up when they will. I like that very much, and I think there's probably a lot of wisdom in that. Sometimes the way to get back on your feet is exactly that, to act the faith even when you don't feel it, and then because you're acting it, it will come. Some months ago, I clipped out a little piece from the New York Times. David Brooks, the columnist from New York Times, he wrote a piece back in April entitled, "What Suffering Does." Unusual, because he normally writes on political matters. This wasn't political at all. It was a religious piece, if nothing else. And in that little op-ed piece, What Suffering Does, Brooks said a number of, I thought, pretty wise things. Among them, he says that, our culture seems so obsessed with happiness and ease, but the irony is that it's often the ordeals of our life that turn out to be the most significant in shaping our character. He says, I don't mean to suggest that all suffering is good or that we seek it out, but what suffering sometimes does is give us an important piece of information. It brings home to us what we can control in life and what we can't control. And when we know that, we know a lot about ourselves. We know specifically where to focus our energy and to understand that though we can't determine the course of our pain, we can certainly make some choices in how we respond to it. And in the article, what Brooks said, for him, the great example of that was how many of those parents who lost children at the Sandy Hook shooting, you remember that tragedy out in Connecticut, how many of those parents have found as a way of responding to this enormous suffering, being involved in foundations designed to make a difference for the greater good. He cited just one, the Sandy Hook Promise Foundation, which parents have taken up as a cause and raised funds for and promote, and it's to advocate for sensible mental health wellness assessments for children who are at risk for acting out in a violent way. And also they've advocated for some common sense gun safety and gun access solutions, policy solutions that protect children better. Haven't gotten a lot of traction with it, but they have thrown themselves in to this bigger good as a result of saying, I can't get what I would like to have. What I want out of this situation is my child back, but since I can't have that, the next choice I can make for good is this. And sometimes Brooks says this of it. He says, it's not that their hurt vanishes or their loss is gone when they did this, but it does allow them, through their positive choice, to say, even in life's most painful limits, the choice to do something positive is still with me. I think given that reminder that, we can't always control what happens to us, but what we can do is control our response to what happens to us. I think that's what God was up to that day with Elijah and with that question at the mouth of the cave there. What are you doing here? What are you doing here? And it's what God is up to in our lives too when, for us, the bottom falls out in some way or other and we find ourselves, as Gatemouth Moore says, singing the blues. Anybody who's got sense sometimes doesn't. I think to listen in those low moments for that still small voice is never to be truly without a choice for good, and it's never to be without, like those tribal elders, that kind of gentle hand of God reaching down to pull us up out of the hole and shake off our self-pity and plant a little tree and send us down the road, maybe even rejoicing.